Welcome, everybody. We're about to go live now. Please note this session is being recorded and will be made available shortly after the event. So thank you for taking the time to join us today at Law, Justice, and Development Week 2020. This is an annual event sponsored by the legal department at the World Bank Group. This year, of course, we are virtual. Thank you for signing on and joining us. We are very pleased to provide a session on exposure notification systems, privacy smart responses to COVID-19. My name is Tammy Dockin. I am the World Bank's Chief Data Privacy Officer. I will moderate the session today and with the help of my team, take questions which you can submit on the platform. So we have a great panel here today. I'm very excited. These are the rock stars of the data privacy world. We have Mr. Keith Enright, Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer for Google. Ms. Kalinda Reyna, Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer for LinkedIn. We have Todd McKinnon, CEO and founder of Okta. And we have Ms. Gina Paik, Director of Global Privacy for Apple. And to deliver closing remarks, we have Anna Bearday, who is Vice President for the World Bank's Europe and Central Asia region. Before we begin, though, we are very honored to have Sandy Okoro, Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the World Bank Group and Vice President Compliance for the World Bank, which is the unit that houses the Data Privacy Office here at the World Bank. Sandy is a great champion of data privacy and advocate for our group and our efforts at the bank. So Sandy, we're thrilled to have you provide some opening remarks today. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tammy, and welcome to the rock stars on the panel. It's great to see you here today, and I'm looking forward to everything that you have to say. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who's tuning in virtually. This is the first time that we've had a fully virtual LJD week. So welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining in this experiment. This session is broadcast live, so but you can watch it on replay as well. Today's discussions will focus on, as Tammy has said, the privacy smart responses to COVID-19. And this topic really will have implications in the world for years to come. We live in a time when personal information is a cornerstone for both business and governance models. And we expect that these models are working in our favor to keep us safe. But are they? Well, take, for example, advertisements. We all receive these very personalized contents on our phone and our other mobile devices. And this is in direct relation to how algorithms are customized based on our personal data. And I must admit that sometimes I feel as if my phone is listening to the conversations I'm having, because all the time there pops up recommendations to watch Idris Elba movies and for anti-aging face cream. So I don't know how it knows that, but it seems to know every sort of, even the conversations I'm having in my head, which is very worrying. And by the same logic, should we trust our health and well-being that is given the same sort of treatment? So lots of questions out there that I'm sure this panel will be discussing later. And this question looms particularly large when we feel most powerless and disconnected, especially as many of us feel during this time of COVID-19, where the world is literally halted in its tracks for all of us. And I don't think there's anyone who hasn't had their lives disrupted in some sort of a way. And I hope you're all well and healthy, and so are your families. Fortunately, there are hardworking individuals in both private and public bodies who have dedicated the last few months to developing tools and strategies to help find concrete solutions. Such solutions are there for better tracking the damages caused by the pandemic to creating effective action plans. Data privacy plays an important role at every stage. And we know how important tracking systems are in this pandemic, but so is data privacy. And we must remember that we need to balance the two and not forget, and not forgo one for the other. So today's discussion with our rockstar panelists will look to the questions of trust, fairness, transparency, effectiveness, and representation. We will hear about the tools the tools that have been developed and learn more about the panel's view on the importance of data privacy in a post-pandemic world. And to conclude, I look forward to hearing what each of your entities have been working on, you Rockstars, you, and trust that our online audience as well will walk away more informed and aware about the privacy and importance of personal information, and hopefully we'll have some more questioning around how our data is used. But before I hand back to Tammy, let me leave you with a data privacy joke. Okay, here you go. I expect you all to laugh heartily if you want to. So, have you heard the GDPR joke about the man from Spain? No? Unfortunately, I can't tell you as the data subject has not given permission and I have no other legal basis for processing the joke. So I guess joke books will now be popping up on my phone as advised reading, no doubt. So anyway, I'm going to hand back to Tammy. Tammy, you try and follow that joke. And I hope you all enjoy the session. I'm really looking forward to it. This is one of the most important topics out there at the moment. And I hope that I know that we will learn and learn a great thing in this session and listening to everybody in the panel. So Tammy, thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Sandy. Wonderful introduction. And I don't think I could possibly follow up with another, I'm going to say privacy dad joke. That's really what that was. But thank you for that. So you touched on, can't hear you. Sandy, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I think you just invented a new expression, privacy dad joke. I think that will be taking over the internet soon. Back to you.
If we have it our way, it will. We privacy geeks anyway. So thanks so much for that. Want to just capture one word that you touched on, which is trust. And as you and I know, we are really working to build trust and maintain trust in how the bank uses personal data. So that's really cornerstone to our efforts. As we dive into the session today, first I'd like to invite our guest speakers to provide a 2-minute just introduction of your company and you and what your focus has been on, and then we will move to a Q&A session. So Keith, let's start with you.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Tammy. My name is Keith Enright. I serve as Google's Chief Privacy Officer. I won't waste people's time with an introduction of Google. I think most of you are probably familiar at this point. But in my role, I do a few different things. I work with the senior-most product leadership across the company to make sure that we are integrating privacy into our product strategy at the most fundamental levels. I also look after our legal team for privacy around the world. And that, among other things, for purposes of our conversation today, gave me this tremendous privilege to work with both product people as well as with my counterparts at Apple and elsewhere to see what benefit we might be able to bring in the context of exposure notification to help public health authorities around the world respond to the crisis of COVID-19.
Great, thank you, Keith. Gina, let's turn to you next.
Sure. Thanks, Tammy. I'm Gina Paik. I'm Director of Global Privacy at Apple, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. I'm happy to talk about our work with Google on exposure notifications, especially our approach to privacy, which was a key part of the design. And this is not just because privacy is one of Apple's core values, but also because user trust, as you mentioned, is crucial for success. This is a theme we'll touch on again during the panel, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Gina. Kalinda.
Thanks so much, Tammy, and thanks everyone. It's really quite an honor to be here amongst the privacy rock stars and to be speaking to those of you at the World Bank who I think we all appreciate so much the efforts you're making right now as we are in the midst of a pandemic and a global economic crisis. And I think we're seeing millions of people right now out of work. And as a result of that, really a growing dependency on technology to make our lives work. I have 3 children who are now doing homeschooling. I do my entire job online. And I think what we are seeing through this pandemic is an incredible creation of data where we have fast forwarded from where we were just literally 8 months ago in terms of how much we and our children are doing online. And so I think now more than ever, we recognize here at LinkedIn that we are a source for people to truly connect with that economic opportunity right now when people are out of work. But also one of the really important roles the platform has come to play is a place where people can gather in the virtual water cooler or kitchen and connect with each other again in a professional environment. And so for us, we have been thinking about that role that we play in how we've approached the pandemic in terms of trying to make sure we're helping people connect with opportunity and connect with each other in a trusted way. And I'm very lucky to be at a company that I think recognizes that this is, in creating that trust, it's not just my job or my team's job, but really the job of every single person at the company. And I think I want to just thank the folks here from the World Bank who not only put this group together to have this important discussion, but who are joining to listen in and recognize that the amount of data we're all creating today is a real issue, and it requires people who are focused and caring about it to recognize it as part of their jobs, even if they don't have privacy in their title.
Great. Thank you, Kalinda. Very important words. And Todd, I turn it over to you.
I'm the CEO and co-founder of Okta. Okta is a cloud platform that we sell to businesses, enterprises, and it does two things. One is that it helps our customers secure the login and the authentication and the access control to all of their applications that they need to do their job. And that's one thing. And then the other thing we do is we help our customers connect to their customers. So if you're jetblue.com, if you log into jetblue.com to reserve a flight or frequent flyer site, you log in through Okta. If you log into the Major League Baseball at-bat app to watch baseball games around the world, or mostly probably in the US, you log in through Okta. So that is an interesting perspective to bring to this conversation, because every organization and every company in the world right now is figuring out, we have great representatives from, Google and Apple and LinkedIn, but every company in the world is figuring out basically how they're going to be the next great tech company, how they're going to take their business and put it online. And guess what? When they do that, they run smack into all of these challenges and balancing off business and innovation with privacy and security. So we see it really firsthand, and it's a pretty interesting topic that there's a lot of work to be done to figure it out. So I'm excited to talk about it today. Great.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, everybody. We'll jump right in now with some questions. Keith, I'll start with you. So COVID-19 really took everybody by surprise around the world. It's likely that more could have been done as a society to be prepared. From a data privacy and legal perspective, do you see that there could have been benefit from other frameworks or other guidelines that would have helped Google be more agile in its response?
It's an interesting question. We have the benefit of perhaps having the most deeply scrutinized privacy program in existence. So I would actually say, of course, the COVID-19 crisis created all of the challenges for us that it created for so many other organizations, not the least of which is the stresses that it created on teams and on people to adapt to this new reality quickly while preserving a level of service and answering the mail. I would actually say I was quite impressed by the resilience of the organization in the face of that sort of change. And I would credit that to a strong tone from the top, very clear signals from leadership at the outset that we were not going to make privacy compromises in the way that we were going to adapt the business to the requirements that the crisis presented to us. And also we had very clear and well-tested governance protocols within the company, which was essential. It allowed us to assess the situation as it unfolded, make high confidence decisions, move quickly, and execute. Now, there were novel challenges that came up that I don't think any framework would have prepared us for. When leadership decided very early in the crisis, we wanted to do what we could to help. and that was separate from commercial interests. That then created these new avenues of opportunity, engaging with Apple as a partner on the exposure notification project. That caused us to kind of explore new ways of operating together. How do you create an appropriate level of transparency with a third party to collaborate on a project like this? As Gina said, recognizing that the fundamental criteria for success was going to be user trust. At the end of the day, everything we needed to do needed to be absolutely transparent, and we needed to instill the highest level of confidence in regulators, in key opinion formers, as well as in individual users of our respective products and services. So I don't think that there's a specific external framework that would have equipped us to do that better. But the fact that we had strong alignment for executive leadership and a strong, persistent commitment throughout to making sure that privacy was going to be the fundamental North Star for everything that we were doing, that allowed us to execute with confidence.
Sounds like a great recipe for building and maintaining trust in Google, which is the tone from the top and buy-in, executive leadership, no compromises, and clear governance structure. That's very, very impressive, and something that we're striving here at the bank to build as we build out our privacy program as well. So thanks for those comments. Gina, let's turn to you next. You and I had the pleasure of speaking with you last week, and we spoke a lot about control and giving users control over the data that they are sharing. Can you speak a little bit about that, and in particular as it relates to the very successful exposure notification platform?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, privacy is a key part of the design. And as he said, it really was our North Star, and that included user transparency and choice. So I think really important to note is each user has to make an explicit choice to turn on the technology, and they can turn it off at any time. We also focused on other privacy principles, including data minimization and on-device processing, since these are also really critical to fostering trust in exposure notifications. For example, the framework uses random identifiers that change frequently and don't include information about user identity. Again, I'd say our view is that privacy is a core value, but it's really crucial to ensuring and maintaining user trust, and that in turn was really critical for adoption.
Great, thanks for that, Gina. Kalinda, let's turn to you. So as you mentioned in your opening remarks, COVID-19 has left many unemployed or underemployed, and many reevaluating what might come next as they embark on post-COVID situations, and an opportunity to reset, develop new skills and interests, and perhaps come out on the other side even better. How does LinkedIn facilitate these aspirations?
Well, Tammy, I'm so thankful for you asking that question, and especially in a group of people here at the World Bank who I know can actually impact some of what is going on in the world today in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the unemployment crisis. As it stands today, Microsoft estimates nearly 250 million jobs could be lost in this year alone. And I think that's a really significant thing for us to keep in mind. On one hand, we are fighting a very significant pandemic, and thank goodness we have companies like Google and Apple working to help us with technology to track that. But on the other hand, there is a significant impact to people in terms of their opportunity to find jobs, and some of those jobs have simply just gone away. And so what LinkedIn is really focusing on is trying to create 150 million tech jobs in the next 5 years. We're projecting that that is possible and an area where there will be great growth, where you see people having lost jobs in the tourist industry or in the restaurant industry or other places where people have to be in person. One of the things we're looking for our platform to try and help people right now is in reskilling themselves. So our latest research reveals that it's possible to help move workers into the jobs of the future, even if they don't have that full skill set today. And so we have joined our parent company, Microsoft, in making a commitment really to open up 1,000 hours of free learning courses from both Microsoft and LinkedIn. And I encourage, if those are interested in learning more about that, especially for different parts of the world you might represent in your jobs at the World Bank, go to opportunity.linkedin.com. And that will show you where some of the jobs are that we know are in demand and growing. And then also, we are really just trying to use what is on our platform to help people make those connections, learn new skills, learn how to interview for those jobs. And I think that we really have an opportunity right now to help workers globally in a moment of true crisis, quite honestly. And we're going to have a rethink about what are those roles and those jobs going forward in this economy when we come out of this pandemic.
Great, thanks, Kalinda. And do you envision these resources staying available once we hit, post-pandemic, whenever hopefully that might be?
Well, in terms of the 1,000 hours of free learning, I'm not sure about that because that is something we've instituted for the pandemic specifically. But all of the tools that we have on our site in terms of helping people prepare for interviews, helping people get connected, helping people take LinkedIn courses to reskill themselves, those are things that are always there on LinkedIn. They just become even more relevant to people, and we're seeing more people take advantage of them right now.
Great, thanks, Kalinda. Todd, turning to you, thanks for being with us today and sharing a bit about what your company does. Sounds like it's very critical to basically everything. But given the public's concern over use of data, not just our consumer data and other data, which Sandy mentioned in her opening remarks, but now in the age of COVID-19 and using more personal data in order to combat and get COVID under control, what do you see as an appropriate or ideal framework for legislating how companies use personal data, both in COVID-19, but also just in our everyday lives?
It's a really important topic. Just to underscore, people think about this topic a lot of times vis-a-vis the name brand biggest tech companies that you've heard of. And one thing that people miss is that, I said this before, but every company is trying to be at some level a tech company, trying to connect with their customers online. And that means transition to a more tech-oriented business, no matter if you're in banking or finance or even if you're running the local hardware store, you're trying to get online and trying to connect with your customers. So these challenges and these opportunities are facing every organization, every part of the economy, which is why I think it's really, really important that there is broad legislation and regulation that actually puts the guardrails on for in a smart way, in a balanced way, for companies to make some of these decisions inside of these guardrails. Now, the hard part is that a lot of these things aren't clear because you have to balance, too much. You have to balance the need for data and the need for companies to have data and use it for some of these amazing life-saving use cases like COVID-19 tracing, contact tracing, et cetera. But you also don't want to go too far. You want to have it be limited to preserve users' security and privacy. In fact, one thing we did was, we were thinking about these issues and how to approach them. We did a survey. We surveyed 12,000 people around the world and got their thoughts on this. And we learned some interesting things. You can read all about it on our website. It's called our Okta Cost of Privacy Report. And it's basically, we found that companies or people, individuals, don't understand how much of their data is tracked and used online. And on the other hand, a very high percentage of them also really, really value privacy. So the first thing that has to be done is just a lot of education. So just broad education of people. And then the second thing is companies like, the folks on the panel here need to do the great work they're doing to kind of start setting some of these standards in a technical implementation. You talked about the randomized IDs that Apple and Google are using for the contact tracing. There's a lot of best practices that some of the leading tech platforms can start to put out there, but it does need to be taken up in a broad legislative frameworks so that every organization and every company can have a better chance to implement some of these things as they transition their business. And the last thing I'll say before I wrap up my comment on this is that communicating and being transparent with consumers is very important. And it goes beyond just informing them. I think if anyone that's ever clicked around the online lately has clicked through 1,000 accept cookie banners, right? So that's a good example where we're trying to be transparent and communicate, but we're not hitting the mark, because I think things like that just probably confuse consumers more than they clearly communicate. So I would say, good technical standards, legislative oversight, and clear, transparent communication will lead us to a good, successful framework.
Great, thanks, Todd. One of your initial comments reminded me that about 10 years ago, I heard a medical device company refer to itself as a tech company, not a health company, not a device company, but a tech company, because it necessarily was collecting all of the data in a pacemaker or in some other device. And that just really struck with me and has ever since. So definitely all companies are becoming tech companies. I'm going to look up your study on the cost to privacy. It also reminds me of a study that a think tank connected with the World Bank has conducted, and I've spoken about this before, and we will highlight this in our Data Privacy Day events. But there's a study where lower income populations have been given choices of paying higher in dollars or time in order for a better cost on a product, but they have to give up their privacy. And overwhelmingly, even individuals who are struggling with time and money value their privacy and will pay in time and money in order to preserve it. So I think you're absolutely right. We have a lot to learn about just how much data is being collected and how and where it's going. So great effort on that. So let's turn now back to exposure notification systems. And Keith and Gina, I'd love to hear more about how the Apple Google platform came about, some of the decisions that you made, the pivot points where you were deciding on how to set this up and how it would be deployed. I think it's such a unique and heartwarming response for these times to see two competitors in the private sector come together like this. But before I turn to you, just want to note to the audience, please feel free to submit questions in the chat function. We will have hopefully some time at the end to turn to your questions. But first, Gina, can you talk us through some of the decision points and how this exposure notification system came about?
Sure. So I think one key decision was to use Bluetooth technology. I know that early on during the pandemic, there was some discussion of using location, for example, to aid contact tracing efforts. And our decision to use Bluetooth instead was something that was decided very early on, because both companies agreed that we should design the system in a way to prevent it from being used for surveillance or tracking. And also proximity is actually an important factor in determining potential exposure, and Bluetooth does a really good job of establishing proximity without using location information. And another key privacy factor that we considered when we were really thinking about how to design the framework overall is that we should really focus on on-device processing. So matching for notifications is all done on device, and the identities of users who report positive aren't shared with other users, Google or Apple. So as both Keith and I mentioned earlier, as our engineering teams were focusing on designing how exposure notifications should work from the very beginning, they were really very focused on putting in really key privacy protections. And for Apple in particular, that meant really anchoring on our 4 fundamental privacy pillars. So transparency and choice, on-device processing, security. And so, we really decided to just continue to adhere to those principles, use those as our North Star to ensure that the system was developed in a way that was both efficacious, but continued to maintain privacy protections at its core. Because as I mentioned earlier, without those protections, you could lose user trust. And in order for exposure notifications to be effective, to be useful to public health authorities, you really had to have user trust, because as I said earlier, it's up to the user who has to choose to turn on the technology in the first place, and they can choose to turn it off at any time. So they need to have confidence and a feeling of trust in the way the framework is designed overall.
Trust, such a key factor, isn't it, in everything that we're trying to do. Thanks for that, Gina. And the Bluetooth technology and the storage on device, I think, is really key to making this, to enabling people to trust using this. Keith, let me ask you to give just an overview of what an exposure notification system does, more particularly what the Google Apple platform, how it's set up and how it can help the public and those of us who are considering using or downloading an app to do this. Can you just walk us through the basics?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in setting that up, I think it's helpful to elaborate a little bit on what Gina was setting out, which is we really had 3 challenges that we needed to address in order to make any kind of meaningful contribution in the space of exposure notification. There was the technical challenge, which is what Gina was talking about at first there. Could we use the Bluetooth protocol to use proximity data instead of location data to support traditional contact tracing efforts? And this is, I think, one thing that is easily lost in the discussion. We are not trying to do contact tracing, right? Contact tracing is a methodology that's been in use for over 100 years. It's very well established, and public health authorities know how to do it. We don't presume to know how to do any of that better than they do. What we want to do is bring the benefits of technology in terms of speed and scale to support their work. And part of doing that was figuring out, could Bluetooth be used to kind of add some technical value to that process? Then we had a political challenge that we needed to untangle, which was sovereign nations around the world had strong, compelling interests in figuring out how to solve this problem for themselves. And we were trying, as a relatively new entrant into that conversation, to say we have some ideas we think might be helpful, but we needed to approach that with humility and drive some consistency of approach across all of those audiences. That was sort of a huge part of the challenge for Gina and I and others to kind of engage in those conversations with national health authorities on the technology and the policy side to figure out what was good common ground there. And specifically, in the context of privacy, one of the things that I think was a significant learning for me and for my team was we came into this conversation confident that we could add value through the exposure notification protocol that we were working through, but we were facing skepticism on the other side, where folks felt like if we were optimizing for privacy, we were doing that to the detriment of efficacy. And that turned out not to be true. Like, as we learned more and more about the data, we could do this in a privacy optimized way and produce the greatest level of efficacy that was attainable, and avoid some of the privacy risks and pitfalls that Gina was pointing to. So that was kind of where we needed to carry those conversations with thought leaders and policymakers around the world. And then the last bit, which is a gate I don't think we've totally crossed yet, there's a psychological challenge here, right? Which is users are understandably concerned about sharing sensitive location data, which is how they perceive this. There's an educational curve. We're talking about proximity information. There is a logical presumption that we're talking about location data. So how do we get past that educational curve and help users understand the public health benefits of what we're trying to do here are compelling, and we need to drive the greatest possible levels of adoption to maximize those public health benefits. Now, coming back sort of directly to your question, I think Gina laid it out nicely, actually, that by users installing an application that was designed and provided by their relevant local health authority. They choose to engage in this proximity sharing scheme that's been put together. And then if a user is exposed and they go and get tested, then they can report that information based on certain criteria that are defined by their health authority. They can be given an exposure notification, the people that they came into proximity with can be given an exposure notification via the app, and they can be given specific instructions that again are calibrated to their local health authority. So their health authority may encourage them to go and get tested if they have the capacity to support testing in that locality, may encourage them to quarantine. All of these things can be adjusted by the public health authority so that they're optimizing based on the capacity and the abilities of that health authority in the way that they want to manage this risk within their jurisdiction.
Fascinating and great distinction between contact tracing and exposure notification. I'm constantly trying to tease those two out so that people understand that exposure notification doesn't do the same thing as contact tracing, which has been around, as you said, forever, where you would try to identify with whom you've been in contact and decide or track the spread of a virus in that way. This is really much more done in a way that doesn't identify exactly where you've been, but it just says that you may have been in proximity to somebody who has now tested or has shown signs of the virus. So really, really interesting to make that distinction of contact tracing versus exposure notification. So thanks for that. And again, I applaud the partnership between Apple and Google. I think that's really, again, just such a bright spot in the in a bleak, what can be a bleak world. So thank you for that to both of you. Let's turn back to regulation and talk about some of the struggles and hurdles that we have. And Todd, I'd like to ask you, how do we anticipate what some of the next issues will be with use of personal data? We know what we know now, but there's a saying in ice hockey, where's the puck going? Where do we go next? And how do we anticipate that with regulation that we might be envisioning or trying to put into place? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that it's, balance is really important. And I think the only way you can get balance is more of an iterative approach. I think it's you run a big risk of really constraining innovation or shutting down things you wouldn't want to shut down when you take too big a bite in terms of what you want to regulate. I think a good example is, obviously the biggest example is, what we just talked about, contact tracing. You could have over-regulated that 5 years ago and precluded these kind of solutions from coming out now. So I think what I think is the right balance is an iterative, or will achieve the right balance is this iterative approach where we regulate things that make sense and in terms of like notification and transparency. That's something that makes sense, but don't go so far that you make it so confusing for consumers that you over notify. I think we're seeing, in California, here in the US, we're seeing challenges with that, with the recent legislation that we've passed in California. So I think it's part of the process. And I think it's also inevitable with tech becoming such a big part of every organization. We're going to have more regulation. And if we can, make smart decisions based on the real challenges in front of us and the real solutions that have proven to work, and proven to be effective, we can make progress.
Yeah, great comment on balance, and it's got to be an iterative process. I also would like your thoughts on using privacy as a distinguisher and a factor in making a company more attractive to consumers because they're doing what consumers want or respect versus what they can do. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we talked about our research. You mentioned other studies that people have done. it's pretty unequivocal that consumers want privacy. And even to the like you pointed out, even to the degree that they're not willing to be paid to give it up. And so that's true. And I think that companies that are trying to balance off innovating technically and building products that consumers love while making sure that the privacy the consumer standard of privacy is upheld is a challenge everyone's trying to work through. I would say that, like saying what I've said before, it's kind of like transparency and openness and disclosure are very important. But the other thing I would throw in there is that we also see companies differentiating on the degree to which they make that simple. So the degree to which you can see what data a company has on you, the degree to which you can easily opt out of having that be retained and not have to run through 15 hoops on a website that you don't understand. So it's not only differentiating on privacy, but it's also differentiating on the ease and the experience with which you understand what's going on, or starting to differentiate companies.
Very interesting. Make it consumer friendly, user friendly. That's certainly a great concept. Kalinda, sticking on the topic of regulation, and as Todd mentioned, Prop 24 passed in California, and so the California legislation will continue to evolve and is certainly at the forefront of US regulation. But setting that aside, but what would be the top 3 things that you would like to see in privacy or data protection regulation? What do you think are the top 3 key things?
Well, Tammy, it's always tough when someone asks a privacy advocate what 3 things you want, but I'll try to narrow it down. The first one I'd say is flexibility. And I think something Todd said that we really need to keep in mind is that if we had thought about contract tracing 5 years ago, or what Google and Apple have developed here in order to do exposure notification, we might have legislated that out. And so one of the things we need is flexibility in whatever we design as a privacy law that allows us to have technology continue to develop, because quite honestly, our boundaries of what we consider private are changing all the time, and technology is constantly pushing us. I will say my children being on Zoom all day long and me walking behind them has changed our perceptions of privacy. So there needs to be flexibility in a law that we design to take into account where technology might take us. And we don't want to limit ourselves in whatever we develop. So I think that's very important. And in some sense, the GDPR is a great model of designing a law that is broad in approach without being so specific that it limits companies' abilities to do things. It puts in place restrictions around how we do those things and requires us to take certain extra steps, but it doesn't stop us from being able to kind of dream of whatever possibilities our data scientists or engineers might be able to come up with. So I think flexibility is really important. A second thing I want to highlight is design. And I think this gets to what Keith and Gina are talking about when they were talking about how they developed the app that they did, because you can hear in their conversation, they thought about Bluetooth, they thought about keeping the data on the device so that it wasn't accessible outside of it. And these are things that those of us who work in companies are thinking about all the time in our jobs, working with privacy engineers and others to think of how do we take this technology and design it in a way that protects data? Because quite honestly, as Todd is saying, it is overwhelming for users to try and make some of these choices. And really, some of that should be on us as companies to do the responsible thing, to think through how do we minimize the data here? What are some of the privacy engineering techniques we can apply to limit the use of personal data? How do we think about doing things in a way that's different, sometimes harder, but different, and that protects privacy? Because again, we are living, our lives today. I mean, my entire life is online right now. My health appointments, my work, my kids' school, my grocery shopping, right? So we are creating more data than we ever have before, and I don't see that slowing down. So that means that it needs to be sort of everyone's responsibility to take care of the hygiene of that and think about it. And then the last thing I'd say, beyond flexibility and design, is that it requires some form of control for consumers. And I think we've got to think about control, though, very smartly, because as Todd pointed out, when you see these cookie consents popping up all the time, people stop paying attention. You just hit accept. You just want to move on. So we need to think about what are the things people should have the most control over. What do they really need to be able to make decisions on that are key to their lives? Is it the cookies on their screen every 30 seconds? Or is it other fundamental decisions about, who do I want to have access to my kids' medical records? What do I want my children's school to do with the data I give them? Right now, some of my kids are actually going in person to school. And so I fill out a form every single day about their health and their temperature and a whole 4 questions that I have to do. Who do I want to be able to use that data? So we need to be thinking through the type of controls we're giving people and make them meaningful, rather than something that people just feel they need to click OK to get to that next stage of actually doing what they want to do with the technology. So I think if we could get those 3 things, that would be wonderful. I think we're making good progress with California always leading the charge. Proud Californian, I have to say we were the first state to require privacy policies. We've come a long way. But I do think there's a role for tech and any other organizations that are collecting a lot of data to help push forward federal legislation here in the US and see it as a benefit. When we have clarity, it makes it easier for businesses to do what they want to do and for us to innovate. So I actually think it's something that is a positive for business at the end of the day.
Very, very important. So flexibility, design, and control. Back to, again, Gina's comments and what we've been discussing. And Kalinda, I think you just revealed a privacy officer's secrets that we don't read those either. We just click through and keep going. I'll admit that.
You can't keep up. You can't keep up.
You can't keep up. You can't keep up. But I think that just says that perhaps there's room for improvement on finding a way to keep us as consumers or users of technology and an opportunity to improve how we are transparent and how we can make that work without being inundated with all of the notifications. Very, very true. I'm going to go to a question that we have from the audience. This came in and it says, the Wall Street Journal has said that 70+% of cases, the origin of transmission is unknown. If aerosols play a larger role than currently understood, such as in an elevator or conference room where individuals never come into contact, can existing Bluetooth technologies be effective for contact tracing? A perfect question for Keith or Gina. Keith, do you want to take this?
I'm happy to sort of say what I can and invite Gina to correct all the things that I'll inevitably get wrong. On this one, I would say it validates one of the points that Gina made earlier, which is we have come into this crisis with imperfect information and an incomplete understanding of the challenge that we are facing. So the most important design consideration after user protection that we needed to keep front and center was flexibility. The teams have had to ingest new research, new findings, new insights, day to day, week to week, month to month as this project is, and that's going to continue, right? We're going to continue learning about the virus and we're going to do whatever we can to adapt the technology to deliver the best possible public health outcomes. As to the specific question, I don't think we ever presumed that the exposure notification technology was going to be able to achieve 100% confidence of flagging every incident of exposure. There are going to be all sorts of things that fall outside of the capabilities of this particular application. However, what we are seeing is that these exposure notifications are in fact valuable to drive positive public health outcomes. So the fact that they're not catching every exposure event, and no one should assume because they do not get an exposure notification that there's no chance that they've been exposed. The fact that we can alert people who have come into an area where they may have come into sort of a higher risk population, that can potentially lead to better public health outcomes. That's what we're after, and we're trying to optimize and work with public health authorities to approach that problem as intelligently as we can.
I would just add to that, I agree with everything that Keith said, but I would just add to that and actually amplify a point that he made earlier, which is exposure notifications really is a technology that's intended to assist public health authorities in their traditional contact tracing efforts. And this is where that kind of supplement comes into play. While the Bluetooth technology in and of itself may not be able to catch every single instance of exposure, it does assist a public health authority in their kind of more manual contact tracing efforts, which may uncover the types of situations that your hypothetical identifies. So it's really intended to assist and provide better data points and more information, both for individuals so that they understand their exposure risk, but also for those individuals, if they wish to do so, for example, to reach out to their public health authority, and then the public health authority can engage in those more manual contact tracing efforts and possibly identify the types of situations that your question really highlights.
Great, thank you. And just a follow up to the exposure notification system, again, envisioning a time where COVID is under control and there's a vaccine and we are all back to whatever that new normal is. Do you see a role for exposure notification systems going forward, not just for pandemic or COVID purposes, but do you see this playing a broader role in our everyday lives?
I can take a first take at that, Keith, and feel free to chime in. But, our plan all along has been to disable exposure notifications on a regional basis when it's no longer needed, obviously in coordination with public health authorities. We've all seen that the number of cases has ebbed and flowed, and unfortunately, we're seeing the numbers begin to peak again in many parts of the world. So we really need to see how things develop and work with public health authorities. And to one of the points Keith made earlier, this is an initiative that's required a lot of innovation and taking in a lot of inputs in dialogue with governments and with health organizations around the world. And we will continue to take that feedback and see what needs to be done in the future. But our plan right now really is to disable the technology on a regional basis when appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I just echoing what Gina said, I think that's all exactly right. I will say the strong and unwavering intention here is to sunset this technology. Again, in advance of that stated objective we had from the outset, which is we need to maximize for user trust. We've made commitments to users that this is a narrowly tailored solution to try to solve a very specific threat and problem. That said, when we look out into the future, I think the common thread of every conversation I have about what the world looks like post-COVID is a general sense of anxiety that we're all trying to figure out what that will all look like. I am encouraged that the work that we've done with Apple on this particular project hopefully does show that private sector companies can collaborate responsibly in a private sector, in a responsible way, in a privacy sensitive way, to help solve different kinds of problems and crises that face society. So might this be a sort of a blurry roadmap for how we would approach some other crisis that would come up in the future? I don't know, but I'm optimistic, and hopefully we'll produce some positive outcomes here that, if not us, then others will pick up that mantle and continue trying to solve hard public health problems.
Yes, it's certainly been an anxious time, both what we're living through as well as trying to envision what goes forward. So again, nice to see a beacon of hope and collaboration. And so speaking to that, Todd, I'd like your views on how our current events, both the political arena, COVID-19, race relations, everything that's happened in 2020, how do you see this changing the discourse, if at all, on data protection, which already had been ramping up as a very heated topic and being addressed around the world? Do you see the events of 2020 changing that dialogue at all, or altering it in any?
I think I think about this very broadly. I think of 2020 as pushing the fast forward button into our technological future by 5 years. I mean, whether it's the difference in, just the momentum and habits of stuff we used to do offline and now we'll do online. Like this meeting, right? This meeting probably would have been in person. And we wouldn't have considered doing it on Zoom. So, I mean, everyone knows all these examples, but I really think if you take a step back, the whole world has been, in terms of technological adoption and companies being connected to customers and everything being online, we've pushed the fast forward button 5 years. And so I think what that means is that we have to do all the things we've talked about even faster, regulate in it with a good balance of innovation and consumer protection. And, I really am super impressed by the way, thank you, Apple and Google, for your collaboration, what you've done. We need to do more things like that, specifically to COVID-19, of course, but in other cases as well. And I think that, of course, it's such a big part of all of our lives, and all of our technology is such a big part of all of our lives. It's going to be politicized. That's, nothing to do with the current political climate. That's just the reality of something that becomes such a big part of our lives. And I think that technology and more technology is inevitable. And I think the smarter we are and the more open-minded we are about how to make it best for everyone will lead to the best success for all of us.
Thanks, Todd. Very uplifting as well in looking forward. Kalinda, last question I will pose to you, similar to Todd's. What do you think the events of this last year will have? What effect do you see this year's events having on attitudes toward data privacy and data protection? So our individual attitudes, both as not as practitioners, but as just as users and citizens in the world. What do you think the effect will be?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think Todd's absolutely right. We've fast forwarded several years right now in terms of our technology use. And I think what that means is that a lot of people who are fortunate enough to be able to have strong internet connections are realizing how much we're just technology dependent for our jobs, for education, for access to goods. So I think, for one thing, I worry quite honestly about the digital divide going forward. The number of people who don't have access, and I imagine many people at the World Bank are seeing that in some of the regions they represent, who do not have that same access to technology, do not have access to devices or a solid internet connection. That divide will become greater if we don't solve for that coming out of this pandemic. I think we see that as well in the job market, where we are finding people who did jobs that this pandemic is eliminating, quite honestly, and who knows if those jobs will come back. So there will be an increased focus on trying to reskill people for that future. But my other hope that comes out of this is one of awareness, and I see this amongst the parents that I deal with in my life with my children, is we have a greater awareness of how much data our children are creating and how much data we are creating. And I think people's recognition of how much of their lives they are currently living online and how much they need to use data is resulting in a consumer awareness we haven't previously seen. This has been building over time when you think about Snowden and then Cambridge Analytica and the passage of GDPR. But here in California, we've seen in a period of 2 years, 2 different privacy laws, very extensive privacy laws being passed without question. It was not a hard challenge to win on getting those 2 propositions passed. So what we are seeing is that people are wanting privacy. And I think Todd's report that he was referring to that Okta did also shows that. And so what I hope it means is that while we have a strong desire, it means that more companies like the ones on this call today, as well as organizations like the World Bank, will begin to continue to see their growing role in making sure that data is maintained. Even if we don't have federal legislation in play, I hope that we will. I think there is consumer support for it, and I think we are globally seeing a tremendous growth in various countries in Asia. We see Latin America getting interested in data privacy regulation and enforcing it. But I also hope that that means that we're going to see companies continuing to find ways to help the consumer sort through all of these decisions and make some easier things on the back end that help design our products in a way that protect people's data.
Great. Thank you, Kalinda. Certainly the disparity in access to technology and Wi-Fi is something that the bank is interested in and looking at. And so with that, we are almost out of time, but before we close, we have the honor of turning to Anna Bearday, who is Vice President for the World Bank's Eastern and Central Asia region, for closing remarks. Anna, we're so grateful that you could join us today. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, Tammy, thank you so much. And thanks really for making me be part of this. I have to really thank our partners that you've invited for this session, because it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to how the private sector handles some of these issues. And Tammy, you've already brought some of this thinking to the World Bank Group, but I have to say the last 8 months, I feel like a lot of our discussion have been internal because we don't travel, we don't do the conferences we usually do. So I've always really cherished being engaging with people from outside of our institution and on a topic where I think we're just getting started. It is fascinating to listen to people who actually have spent some time thinking about how to do this in what we sometimes call the real world, the business world. And so it's really fascinating. So thank you so much. I think, as I said, we're just getting started, and we are really preparing for operationalizing the World Bank's data privacy policy come early 2021. And I think it's really important that we do this. Many of you have talked about how it's moving so quickly, and how I particularly resonated with me how, we're so keen to get things done that we are almost forgetting what we're agreeing to. We're just clicking through, right? And when you look at what the World Bank challenge is, and it is challenging, we're an institution that have offices in 150 countries across the world. We have about 30,000 people working in our organization that on any given day is entering data, using data, deploying data. And I think, having any type of consistency across these 150 offices is not easy. We have vivid interactions beyond our own institution with clients across those 150 countries, with beneficiaries who are our ultimate clients, the people with the poor, the vulnerable we're trying to help, and then partner organizations across the world. So it's just, at any given day, you can be touching, hundreds of thousands of people. So it's an awesome and quite humbling effort that we're embarking on. And of course, we do this on top, and even we just had our annual meetings. And I think while we all missed being in person, we touched so many people, and our information is getting so much more outreach thanks to this. It's good, but I don't think it personally takes away from being together. But I do think it's good that we can do more. But I think what we now need to do is really think through how we operationalize this. And for me, being in charge of Europe and Central Asia, we're one of the 6 regions that are undertaking right now the assessment of current gaps in our processes for compliance with the bank's new policy. And then we will have to look at closing those gaps. And what we have identified is that there are numerous processes that we're going to have to go through, and we will do that. But there's also a huge amount of mindset that needs to change, including this idea of, I have an obstacle, I need to get through it. Well, do I need to push on it? Do I not? What happens if I do? And I think, Tammy, you and I exchanged when you came on board. I think you were quite surprised about the amount of data that we were keeping, even, at some level, and who has access to it and so forth. So this is new for us, but it's happening so fast that we really have to catch up with it, because there's a lot of integrity that we need to keep. So I just really want to thank you for letting me sit in and listen to this and learn from you, and just also to just commit myself to doing this the best way we can, learning from the private sector, deploying it into a public sector setting. And Tammy, thanking you for really coming on board and taking us through this very important initiative that we actually hadn't really quite embarked on yet. So for us, this is very, very important. I'm sure that you will continue to have good discussions during the Law, Justice and Development Week, which always is an excellent learning week for our staff who work on legal aspects, but legal aspects touch so many different issues for us now. So look forward to seeing where we can take this, Tammy. And again, I really want to thank the guest, because it's great to hear from you first and center on how you're addressing this in organizations that are so much part of our everyday life. You know, I never really thought about how these big organizations that I wake up to every morning and use so vividly in my own job actually deal with these issues. So with that, I just want to wish you a great LJD week, and our guest speakers, who I thought were just excellent. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna. Thanks again for being here. Thank you to our panelists. Excellent discussion. We've gone over. Of course, we could probably continue the conversation for days on end, but appreciate your time, your sharing your perspectives and the views that you have. And we look forward to speaking again sometime. So thank you. And as Anna said, happy LJD week to everybody here at the bank. And we will see you soon. Be well. Bye, everybody.